It was a slow day at the office, so I decided to run out and buy a few items at the grocery store. Atlanta was enjoying a beautiful fall, which was another excuse to take a few minutes away from my law practice. As I walked through the produce section of the store, I thought, this is weird. What is Jim Davenport doing here on a weekday? I rolled my cart towards him. Hi, Jim. What a surprise to see you in the supermarket on a weekday, I called out joyfully. He smiled when he recognized me. Oh, hi, Miss Sarah. Apparently you didn't hear. I was fired from my job. Oh no, that's terrible, Jim, I exclaimed. I'm so sorry to hear that. I was shocked. Jim was a middle manager in his company and seemed up for promotion. I would never have thought that he would be fired. He smiled again. Actually, this might be good for me. My company needed to cut costs, and apparently I was one of those deemed redundant. But the good news is that they have decided to offer us a continuation of the salary payment, which will last until 55 years old, the age of early retirement. So you don't plan to look for another job? I asked. He thought for a few moments. I spent my entire adult life working to climb the corporate ladder, but now that I'm out of work, I find that I don't miss all that pressure, deadlines, conference calls, and corporate bureaucracy. My wife and I will, of course, be forced to cut our expenses, and Peggy is not very happy about that, he admitted. But if we are careful, everything will be fine. And now that I'm not in this rat race, maybe I can even start enjoying life. I've always wanted to go on a Mediterranean cruise, but I've never found the opportunity to take that much time off. It looks like you had no problem switching to the new regime, I said with a smile. The only real downside I have is that I have so much free time, he laughed. Now that I'm not working 50 to 60 hours a week, I'll have to develop some kind of hobby. I smiled at him. Well, I'm sure your wife is glad you're spending more time at home. If you ask Peggy, you might get a different answer, he chuckled. She doesn't know what to do with me when I'm at home all the time. She says I'm always in the way, that's why I do the shopping. I patted his hand. Well, I'm sure you'll find something to keep yourself busy, but I must admit, this is a pleasant problem. He agreed, and we went our separate ways. I have known him since we both served on the board of a local charity here in Atlanta. Many people use board membership as a way to enhance their resume, but Jim was a true doer who was actively involved in the agency. He even agreed to serve as treasurer for a couple of years, a responsible but thankless task. I had a pretty high opinion of him. I never met his wife Peggy, but I thought that if Jim married her, she must have a lot of qualities. Either way, I hoped they could take advantage of this new opportunity and enjoy life. Retirement can be a wonderful new chapter in a couple's life, but the transition isn't always easy. Of course, I did not know this from my own experience since I was still actively practicing family law, and Marcus got sick long before he reached retirement age, but enough of that. Now is not the time to indulge in self-pity. I have a business. When I returned to my office in the Virginia Highland area of Atlanta, Marcy was waiting for me. Marcella Jackson is my legal assistant. Like me, she graduated from Agnes Scott College. I like to hire helpers from my alma mater. It's one way to give back to the school that has given me so much. But Marcy is different from her previous assistants. Right after graduating, she joined the Army and served in Afghanistan. I was skeptical about the suitability of the experience, and she was equally skeptical about working for me. But after a short time, a strong connection was established between us. I began to rely on Marcy unconditionally, and she proved so responsible and attentive that it was hard to imagine not having her there for me. Interestingly, the very aspect of her experience that confused me, her military background, turned out to be a source of strength. She often surprised me with the way she applied her military experience to situations that seemed to have nothing to do with it, but her perspective often shed new light on the problem. Overall, it was a very successful collaboration. When I walked in the back door with my groceries, Marcy greeted me. "You have a client, Miss Sarah, and she looks very upset." "Did I forget about the meeting?" I asked. I don't remember anyone being on the calendar, otherwise I wouldn't have gone to the store. No, she reassured me. She came without an appointment. I thought. You never know what to expect from those who come without an appointment, but I think it's worth accepting. Well, honey, I said to Marcy, let's see what this lady wants. We walked into the reception area together. Waiting for us was a woman who, in my opinion, was about 40, not beautiful, but what they used to call prominent. She was dressed well and had recently gotten her hair done, but her face looked like she was under a lot of stress. She held her purse in one hand. In the other, there was a sheet of paper, folded and crumpled. I introduced ourselves. How can we help you, Mrs.? I'm Mrs. Harriet Sheridan, the woman replied, and I think I need a lawyer. Please come into my office and let's discuss this, I suggested. After everyone was comfortable and she had a glass of sweet tea to drink, I asked, why do you feel like you need a lawyer, Mrs. Sheridan? Because of this, Miss Sarah, she said, handing me the folded sheet as if it were something disgusting and disgusting. I unfolded the paper and saw that it was an email sent a few days ago. It said, Walter and I had an affair. He loves me and will leave your marriage soon. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you can move on with your life. Walter's true love. I believe Walter Sheridan is your husband, I asked, returning the letter to her. When she nodded, I continued, and what did Mr. Sheridan say about that? He denied everything, she cried. He said he was not having an affair and there was no other woman in his life. But if she is not there, who sent this letter and why? And if he's lying, I need to protect myself. Oh, Miss Sarah, what should I do? I saw that she was very shocked and tried to calm her down. Mrs. Sheridan, do you have any other evidence, any other reason to believe that the sender of this letter is telling the truth? No, she admitted through tears, but I also cannot say with certainty that Walter could not have had an affair. I just do not know. She covered her face with her hands. How long are you married? I asked her. 25 years, she replied. Have you had problems like this before, Mrs. Sheridan? She shook her head sharply in denial. Not at all. Walter has always been good to me, and before this I would have said that we had a strong marriage. He has his flaws, but who doesn't? I reached out to squeeze her hand. Mrs. Sheridan, may I please ask you the most important question? Do you still love your husband? Do you want to stay married to him? Her head shot up. Oh yes, Miss Sarah, I love him. He's a good person. I don't want to lose him. I squeezed her hand, trying to calm her down. Then my advice is to take your husband at his word and ignore this letter. Obviously, someone is trying to interfere in your marriage, whether as a joke or for some other reason that we don't know about. Naturally, you're upset, but remember that anyone can send an anonymous letter. Let's wait and see if anything else happens. If that happens, come back and we'll see what we can do. She took a deep breath. Okay, Miss Sarah, if you think it's right. After she left, Marcy returned to my office. What a terrible thing to do to send such a message. Why would anyone do that, Miss Sarah? That's a good question, Marcy, I replied. From the tone of the letter, this does not appear to be a joke, but rather a deliberate act to sow discord. Is there anything we can do to help her? She wanted to know. I shook my head. Without any information about who sent the letter, we are practically powerless. I guess we'll have to wait and see if something else happens or if ignoring the problem will solve it. I don't like it at all, but realistically we can't do more right now. I don't think either of us were very happy when we left the office that day. Sometimes it feels like you really helped the client. Other times you feel helpless. Over the next few days, the weather became even warmer. I think we had what they call an Indian summer. It was so nice to be outside that Marcy and I decided to pack a picnic basket and head to Piedmont Park for lunch. It was over a mile, but we thought the walk would do us good. As we walked along the sidewalk, I noticed a car in the parking lot that looked familiar. Looking closer, I saw Jim Davenport driving, clearly unconscious. Marcy and I hurried towards him, and I knocked sharply on the window. Jim's eyes opened, and he looked around sleepily. Finally recognizing me, he rolled down the window. "Jim, are you okay? Help is needed?" I asked excitedly. His face turned red with embarrassment. "No, it's okay, Miss Sarah. I must have dozed off," he said quickly. I wasn't so sure. "You better come with us. We're heading to the park. Come with us and have something to eat." Men are always reluctant to show signs of weakness, but Marcy and I wouldn't take no for an answer, and he reluctantly agreed to come with us. After we laid out the blanket under the tree and treated him to lemonade and a sandwich, I turned to Jim. "What did you do there?" He blushed again, and after finishing his piece of chicken salad, he answered, "I was playing detective, Miss Sarah." Needless to say, this piqued our curiosity, and we demanded a full explanation. The gist of his story was that 3 weeks ago Jim was drinking beer with his best friend Jerry Hamilton. When Jim complained about not having enough to do in retirement, Jerry asked him for help. He thought Mandy, his wife, was cheating on him, Jim explained. But he didn't have proof, so he asked if I would be willing to follow her for a while. She works in the building opposite where you found me and usually comes out for lunch once or twice a week. Jerry thought she was meeting her lover for lunch, so I've been watching her for the last 2 weeks to see where she's going. I frowned, but Marcy was intrigued. "What did you find out?" she asked curiously. Jim laughed. "I found out that I'm not a very good detective. The first time I tried this, I saw Mandy leaving the office, but by the time I started the car, I had already lost sight of her. I drove all around, but still didn't see her car. Next time I took a thermos of coffee with me. By midday, I was desperate to use the toilet. When I finally returned to my car, she had already left. I haven't had any coffee this week, but the warm sun must have lulled me to sleep. Her car disappeared when you woke me up." He shook his head. "This detective work is harder than it looks," he concluded ironically. Marcy laughed. "I bet your friend Jerry wasn't impressed with your efforts." "Oh no," Jim said. "Jerry thanked me for trying and practically begged me to continue. He said he couldn't afford to hire a private detective, so he really hopes that I will find out what his wife is doing." Marcy seemed very interested in Jim's story, but I wasn't thrilled. "What does your wife think about your antics?" I asked demandingly. "Peggy doesn't know anything," Jim answered quickly. "Jerry asked me not to tell her anything. He doesn't want to risk word getting back to Mandy." I shook my head and looked to Marcy for moral support, but she seemed lost in thought. "Jim," I said sternly, "you need to stop this nonsense. You're not a detective and you don't have a license. What you are doing is stalking this poor woman. I'm not sure if you're breaking the law, but you're probably pretty close." "But I can't stop now," Jim objected. "Jerry found out that she will have a lunch meeting again this Friday. He made me promise that I would see where she went." Before I could respond, Marcy interjected. "I have an idea, Miss Sarah. Let me do it. When I was in Afghanistan, I served in an intelligence unit in a non-combat role and learned a lot from these guys. I would really like to try my hand at this." "What is an intelligence unit?" asked Jim. "Reconnaissance, surveillance, and target acquisition," Marcy answered quickly. We discussed this while finishing our lunch. I was very reluctant, but it was clear that if Marcy didn't go, Jim would. So finally, against my better judgment, I decided that it would be better for Marcy to take over the case than for Jim. At least that's what I hoped. Jim made her promise that she would give him a full report on Friday afternoon. "I'll go to the movies and then stop by your office to see what you found out. I don't want to break my promise to Jerry," he said. As we walked back to the office after leaving Jim at his car, I couldn't help but ask Marcy why she volunteered to do this. "Why the sudden interest in surveillance? You've never expressed interest in detective work before," I said. "Miss Sarah," she replied, "I have a suspicion." As I listened to Jim, I began to remember some of the things I had read about military tactics, and it reminded me of Operation Fortune. "I would really like to check whether I am right or wrong," she replied. Operation Fortuit? I asked. I've never heard of her. And what does this have to do with watching Jerry's wife? Marcy looked at me warily. I may be wrong, Miss Sarah, so I don't want to say anything yet. Let's wait until Friday to see, are you right? After that, I couldn't get anything more out of her, so after making her promise not to do anything stupid, I reluctantly agreed. I believed in Marcy's common sense, but I really doubted her little mission. Nothing good will come of this, I worried. The next day, I was working at my desk when I heard the front door open. I looked up curiously, since we had no appointments, and saw Marcy escorting Harriet Sheridan. I only had to look at her face, streaked with tears, to understand that our experiment of ignoring the problem had not worked. We quickly sat her down on the couch and Marcy was brought a box of tissues. "What happened, Harriet?" I asked with alarm. "Oh, Miss Sarah, that was terrible. I tried to ignore that terrible letter as you advised, and everything seemed normal until yesterday. And then I got another one," she said. "Was it similar to the previous one?" asked Marcy. "Oh no, it was much worse. It contained details about Walter's body that only a mistress could know. There was no doubt there," said Harriet. I took her hand. "I believe you have encountered Walter. What did he say when you showed him the letter?" "He confessed, Miss Sarah. He admitted that he had an affair with this terrible woman." Her tears began to flow more intensely, and she reached for another tissue. "He swore to me that he tried to stop it, but she wouldn't leave him alone. She kept calling and trying to persuade him to leave me. I think when he refused, she started putting pressure on me." Marcy and I managed to calm her down and get her to take a couple sips of tea. As soon as we succeeded, I looked her straight in the eyes. "Harriet, I have two very important questions to ask you, and I ask you to think about them seriously before you answer. First, does Walter want to end your marriage? Does he want to be with this other woman?" She looked at me with red eyes. "He swears he doesn't, and I believe him. He said he was ready to do anything to save our marriage." She smiled weakly. He was almost as upset about it all as I was. "Then let me ask you a second question, Harriet. Do you want to stay married to him even after what he did? Can you forgive him?" She took a deep breath, and I think she really thought about the question. "I want to stay married, Miss Sarah. I'm so hurt by what he did, but I guess it's not that surprising. Walter is a good person, but not very strong. If she started with him, I wouldn't be surprised that he couldn't resist. However," she continued, "he was a good husband, and I honestly believe he is terribly sorry for how this all turned out. If we work on this, I think I can forgive him. I don't want to throw all those years in the trash, not at this age." Then she frowned, and I thought she was going to start crying again. "But we can't work on our marriage until this woman is out of our lives," she exclaimed. "If you're going to go through this, it's going to take a lot of hard work, and a talented consultant can help a lot in the process." I turned to Marcy. "Can you give Harriet a copy of the list of marriage counselors?" I asked. Then, turning back to Harriet, she said, "If you don't have someone you know, some of my clients have had success with the consultants on this list." "Thank you," she said, taking the list from Marcy. "But what about that other woman?" "Walter told you who she is?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, "but I don't know her." She took out a note from her purse. Walter wrote down her name, address, and telephone numbers. "Okay," I said, taking the note from her. "Why don't you leave?" Here I looked at the paper. "Miss Vera Martindale to me. You go home and tell Walter about our conversation today. The very fact that you came to me will emphasize to him that this is a serious matter and that he needs to make real changes if he wants to save the marriage. Then, if you both still want to save your marriage, call one of these counselors." After we walked Harriet to the door, I began to think about the Sheridan situation. Marriage is rarely an easy relationship, and there are many stresses that can ruin even the best ones. But the couple does not need to struggle with the interference of outsiders. The more I thought about what Vera Martindale was doing, the angrier I became. Marcy followed me back to my office. "What are you going to do, Miss Sarah?" she asked. "I believe a frontal attack should be made, my dear." I noticed that the note included Miss Martindale's work number, so I dialed it. I was pleased when she answered. Miss Martindale, my name is Sarah Cannon. I am a lawyer. You don't know me, but I have important information that can have a significant impact on you. Is it possible to meet you this afternoon at your office? No, this is not a question to discuss over the phone. Okay, if you give me your address, I'll be at your office at 4:30 today. When I hung up, Marcy looked at me with uncertainty. Are you going to meet her? She asked. Yes, I said with a grim smile. I will appeal to her best qualities. When I arrived at Vera Martindale's workplace, the secretary led me into a small conference room. I had barely sat down when the door opened again and a tall, slender woman entered. Her hair was cut stylishly, she wore high heels, a masculine cut blouse, and a pencil skirt that showed off her figure but was still businesslike. Not a real beauty, I thought, but definitely someone who would be very attractive to men. We carefully introduced ourselves to each other, and then she took the lead. I'm very busy, Mrs. Cannon, so let's get down to business. Why are you here? I'm here to keep you from making a fool of yourself over Walter Sheridan, I said. She gasped. I continued. Miss Martindale, I present Walter's wife, Harriet Sheridan. I know everything about your relationship with Walter, and I'm here to put an end to it before you get yourself into a lot of trouble. She stood up from the conference table. You have a lot of nerve to come here, she said sharply. My personal life is none of your business, and you have no right to tell me what to do. I ask you to leave now. I sat quietly. Miss Martindale, you are the one who has no right to try to break up someone's marriage. And if you continue your efforts, you will find that I can do a lot to make you regret it. For example, I could easily get a restraining order that would keep you at least 500 yards away from Mr. and Mrs. Sheridan for the next 3 years. I can file a civil lawsuit against you for harassment for a large sum of money. Just defending against such a claim in court will be extremely expensive for you. Furthermore, I may file a criminal complaint against you for stalking, which will lead to a police investigation. I don't think this will be very good for your career. And speaking of your career, I can notify your company management that you were using the corporate network for personal purposes to send threatening emails. I'm guessing it might cost you your job, but even if it doesn't, your private affairs will be public in the office. Is this what you want, Miss Martindale, or would you rather sit down and continue this conversation with me? As I spoke, I saw her face turn pale under her makeup, and by the time I finished my list, her anger had turned to desperation and desperation. But I love him, she cried, and he loves me. If only he would leave that old corgi, we could be happy together. I'm sorry, Miss Martindale, but that's not true. You know this, otherwise you would not have sent these letters to Harriet to provoke her into divorce. He confessed everything to his wife, and despite your efforts, she agreed to take him back. I leaned across the table. Walter and Harriet have made their choice, Miss Martindale, and you have no right to interfere, especially now that they have done so. You need to back off and leave them alone. She lowered her head onto the table and began to cry pitifully. I listened for a minute, then stood up, walked around the table, and sat down next to her. I know what it's like to lose someone you love, Vera, I said quietly. But sometimes things don't work out the way you want. When this happens, all you can do is accept it and move on. You are a young and attractive woman. I don't believe this is your last opportunity to find love. Her crying subsided, and I handed her a tissue from my purse. She looked at me and asked, Are you still going to sue me and tell my boss? I smiled slightly. No, dear, if you don't bother the Sheridans anymore, I'll have no reason to interfere in your life. I left her sitting there, sad and alone. When I returned to the office, Marcy was eager to find out what had happened. After I recounted our confrontation, she asked, Do you think she'll leave the Sheridans alone now? I sighed. It's hard to say, Marcy. A rational person would do this, but desire sometimes causes people to act irrationally. The fact is that she lived in a fairy tale world. I let her know that in the real world, actions have consequences, Now she knows there will be serious consequences if she tries again. My hope is that the Sheridans won't hear from her again. The next day, I called Harriet Sheridan to tell her what I had done. She seemed to rather enjoy my account of my meeting with Vera Martindale, especially when I recounted the consequences that might await her if she continued her efforts. I asked Harriet to be sure to let me know if Vera tried to contact her again, and she promised she would. She then said that she and Walter had already made an appointment with a marriage counselor. I wished them luck, and she thanked me warmly for everything I had done for her. I hoped that was enough. Since it was Friday, despite my concerns, Marcy left the office before noon to go on her scouting mission. As she left, I once again reminded her not to do anything stupid and to return to the office as soon as possible. I trusted her, and I must admit, I myself participated in several intelligence operations. However, I was still worried. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Marcy returned to the office, and when she walked through the door, there was a strange mixture of emotions on her face. I was very concerned about what this could mean. She sat down heavily next to my table. "Well," I demanded, "what happened? Were there any problems?" She looked at me strangely. "No, there were no problems. No one saw me or knew what I was doing." "So what did you find out? What about your guess?" "My guess was correct, Miss Sarah, but I wish it weren't," she said grimly. After her explanation, I sat quietly for a minute and then picked up the phone and made a call. When I finished, I told Marcy what I thought was going to happen, and we started getting ready. None of us were looking forward to this with pleasure. When Jim Davenport arrived in the afternoon after going to the movies, he was in a cheerful mood. "So, Marcy, are you a better detective than me?" he teased my assistant. She just smiled briefly and led him into my office. Before he could sit down, we heard a knock on the glass at the front door. I left Marcy with Jim and went to open the door. When I returned, I was accompanied by a woman in a business suit. Jim looked up, did a double take, and then blushed from ear to ear. "Mandy, what are you doing here?" Mandy Hamilton looked at Jim with equal amazement. "I could ask the same thing, Jim. Why are you here?" While he was trying to find an appropriate answer, I intervened. "He's here, Mrs. Hamilton, because he's been spying on you for the last 2 weeks or so." She gasped in shock. "Spying on me? For what?" "Go ahead, Jim," I said. "Tell her." He couldn't look her in the eye. Finally, he muttered, "I was trying to find out who you're having an affair with." "What?" she screamed. "I'm not having an affair. Who told you this?" He looked at her awkwardly. "Jerry said." Before she could answer, I intervened again. "Please let me explain what happened so you both understand." I quickly outlined the events that led to today's meeting. Mandy sat frowning, listening. Any amusement Jim might have felt at the beginning of our conversation has long since faded. I turned to my assistant. "Marcy, please tell Mr. Davenport and Mrs. Hamilton what you observed on your reconnaissance mission today." She stood up, spread her legs, and crossed her arms behind her back. It's like she's about to give an army briefing, I thought. All she needs is a wall map and a pointer. Marcy cleared her throat and began. "Most people believe that Eisenhower's invasion of Europe began with Operation Overlord and the assault on Normandy. In fact, the first phase was Operation Fortitude," she began. Both Davenport and Hamilton looked puzzled, so I quickly intervened. "Let's skip the military history lecture and get straight to what happened today, Marcy." "But that's what I do, Miss Sarah," she protested. "It's all about deception and distraction." I just raised my eyebrows and Marcy sighed. "Okay." She took a deep breath. "When Mr. Davenport told us about Jerry Hamilton's request to monitor Mrs. Hamilton and his eagerness to continue despite the lack of results, it all seemed strange to me. The more I thought about it, the more it reminded me of Eisenhower's efforts to mislead Hitler about where to invade Europe." I rolled my eyes, and when Marcy caught my eye, she hurried on. "Anyway, I was playing a guess. Instead of going to Mrs. Hamilton's office today, I went to your house, Mr. Davenport." Why would you do that? He asked in confusion. Because, Marcy replied, I wanted to know why Jerry Hamilton wanted to make sure you were out of the house at a certain time. As the meaning of Marcy's words began to sink in, Jim's face began to darken. But before he could say anything, Marcy turned to Mandy. Mrs. Hamilton, I am sorry to inform you that the reason your husband wanted Jim to tail you was so that your husband could have a safe meeting with Jim's wife at their home. It looks like they've been having an affair for a long time. Mandy Hamilton's face went pale with shock. How can you know this? She demanded. Marcy looked confused. People who have ground floor bedrooms should make sure their curtains are drawn and windows are completely closed before doing anything they don't want others to know. Apparently, Jim's unexpected retirement had disrupted their regular meetings. So Jerry Hamilton came up with the story of your affair as a way to get Jim out of the house. Mandy was outraged, but Jim was in denial and spoke first. I just can't believe Jerry is having an affair with Peggy. He is my best friend. Could this be some practical joke they were playing on me? Marcy looked at me questioningly, and I nodded my head. She took it from an envelope left on the coffee table. I'm sorry, Mr. Davenport, Mrs. Hamilton. I have photographs. With these words, she took out a stack of photographs depicting the couple in sexual intercourse. There were several different pictures, but there was no doubt about the identities of these people or what they were doing. There was a deafening silence in the room as Mandy and Jim looked through the stack of photographs. Both were in a state of shock and anger. Finally, I felt that I had to break the silence. Now that you know what happened, what do you want to do about it? Mandy Hamilton was the first to respond. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she had a determined expression on her face. Miss Sarah, I will be filing for divorce from my cheating husband as soon as possible. Would you be so kind as to represent my interests? I sighed. Yes, under these circumstances, I am ready to do it. A determined expression appeared on her face. Okay, because after what I saw and heard today, I want to punish this scoundrel. He will regret what he did to me. Wait a minute, I said quickly. I know how upset you are about all this, but I hope you're not going to do anything rash. Oh no, Miss Sarah, she replied indifferently. I don't need to do that. Jerry is not as smart as he thinks. I might have a little surprise for him. After she explained what was on her mind, Marcy and I exchanged glances. I couldn't help but remember Congreve's famous line, Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Jim was still sitting quietly. It was obvious that today's revelations had completely overwhelmed him, and he was having a hard time processing what he had seen and heard. I watched him sit, staring at the floor. My heart went out to him. He definitely didn't do anything to be so cruelly betrayed by his wife and best friend. Are you okay, Jim? I asked softly. He looked at a point somewhere above my shoulder and 1,000 yards away. I thought she loved me. I thought we had everything settled. We were going to enjoy retirement. Of course, we had to be careful with money, but I thought we would do everything together, go to places we've never been and share different experiences. I heard the contempt in his wife's voice when she and her lover talked about Jim, and I thought that the chances of reconciliation were slim. But it's not my place to make decisions for my clients, so I wanted him to at least consider his options. Jim, I said softly, perhaps this life is still possible if you can forgive Peggy's infidelity. He shook his head bitterly. I had no idea what she really thought about me. I didn't know that she was unhappy with our marriage. He looked at me and the pain was obvious in his eyes. After she deceived me so much, how could I ever trust her again, Miss Sarah? Maybe counseling can provide answers to these questions, I suggested. He simply shook his head. You heard Marcy's recording. Peggy neither loves nor respects me, and it seems like she hasn't for a long time. All she was interested in was the income I brought in, and now that I'm retired, she doesn't need me at all. I will never be able to forgive, let alone forget all of this. He snorted. And as for Jerry Hamilton, my so-called best friend is still trying to make a fool of me. He called me this afternoon before I came here, And he had the nerve to ask me to keep an eye on Mandy again on Monday. Apparently, he has another meeting planned with Peggy. He looked at me with determination. I will need your services too, Miss Sarah. I try to be impartial to my clients. It doesn't help when you're emotionally involved in their affairs, even if you think they're right. However, I too often find myself more involved than I should be. I was outraged by Vera Martindale's desire to destroy the Sheridan marriage, so much so that I wanted to meet her in person. Now, for the second time in a week, I was outraged by the actions of the spouses who so unceremoniously betrayed Jim Davenport and Mandy Hamilton. My indignation increased. I turned to them. I completely understand your feelings. From what we have learned today, it appears that your spouses have been manipulating and deceiving you both for some time now and taking great pleasure in doing so. I think it's time to put an end to this. In fact, I think we could even give them some of our own medicine if that's what you want to do. I saw Jim and Mandy exchange glances, and for the first time since we met, I saw a spark of life in their eyes. Mandy spoke first. I'd love to do that. Jim simply nodded vigorously. In that case, I said, here's what I propose to do. We spent another hour discussing and refining our little plan. If you want this to work, I told them, you'll have to play this part well over the weekend. You both will have to pretend that nothing happened and that you don't know about their little affair. Can you do this? This will be easy for me, Jim spoke. Peggy is going to Birmingham this weekend to visit her sister, so I'll be single. She'll probably be back late Sunday night, so I won't have to pretend much. I turned to Mandy. I won't have any problems either, she said. It's a big football weekend for Jerry. Georgia plays Tech on Saturday, and he has tickets to the Falcons game on Sunday. I hardly ever see him. Finally, we planned everything. It won't change what happened, but it might help Jim and Mandy feel a little better, and I knew it would give me some satisfaction. Mandy Hamilton went home, but Jim stayed behind. I walked over and sat down next to my friend. What happened, Jim? Miss Sarah, he said decisively, today I learned that my wife doesn't love me and has not loved me for a long time. I learned that she and the man I considered my best friend were making a fool of me and a cuckold in my own bed. I had all sorts of wild fantasies about confrontation and revenge. I looked at him with concern, but he hurried on. But after all this, I decided that I didn't want to face her. I didn't want to listen to her apologies and excuses. In fact, I would be happy if I never saw them both again. The sooner they are out of my life, the better I will feel. I looked at him thoughtfully and then nodded. I understand, Jim. You're not the first client to feel this way. When a spouse's behavior is so egregious, they just want to get rid of them. He nodded. In that case, I continued, I have an idea. You said you wanted to travel. Why not take this opportunity to do so? You could just leave while she's in Birmingham and leave them both to deal with the consequences. A smile appeared on his face for the first time since we met. I like it, Miss Sarah. In fact, I've been researching travel options online for a while now, and there's a cruise ship leaving Miami for the Mediterranean on Monday. I think I'll go for it. She cut me out of her life. Now I'll do the same to her. Then he hesitated. But what about our plan? I smiled at him. Just leave the rest to me. I think I'll enjoy it. Since he was going to be out of reach, we discussed what kind of financial settlement he wanted. After that, he thanked me and left. As he walked out the door, I saw his shoulders straighten, and I felt a little relieved for him. He walks like a man with a purpose, I thought. As Marcy and I cleaned up the office, she looked at me, and I saw that she had a question. Well, what is it? I finally asked. Miss Sarah, she said, I just don't understand. How could these two have an affair without Jim and Mandy knowing about it? They must have had some hints. Not necessarily, Marcy, I replied. In my experience, kind and honest people tend to trust their loved ones. They expect others to act as they do. They are not always on guard against unscrupulous behavior. So good people are just naive and vulnerable? Asked Marcy. Dishonest people can definitely take advantage of them, I admitted, but I've found that they are at a disadvantage too. Because they cheat and lie, they assume that everyone else will do the same and may be just as surprised. Take Vera Martindale. She thought that Harriet Sheridan would divorce Walter after learning about his infidelity. She did not count on Harriet's willingness to forgive her husband. She expected her to throw it away, and her plans were thwarted when Harriet did not do so. Or take our two cheating spouses. I believe our little plan on Monday will work because they think everyone else is just like them. This makes them vulnerable. We finished getting everything ready for Monday, but before we left, Marcy turned to me with a big smile on her face. I guess you've read a little about military strategy too, Miss Sarah. What do you mean, Marcy? She smiled. After hearing what you have planned for Monday, I think you could take a chapter from Operation Desert Storm. This time I understood her reference. We'll just have to see if our little two-pronged attack will be as successful as General Schwarzkopf's, I said with a wink. After a busy but relaxing weekend, Marcy and I arrived at work early on Monday. I had some documents that needed to be filed in court first, but after filing them, we were nervously killing time until Jim Davenport arrived around 11 o'clock. He brought some sandwiches with him, and we all ate them, but were too excited to eat much. Marcy left at noon. Jim and I stayed in the office. Finally, I looked at the clock, which showed 12:30. Okay, Jim, it's time, I said. Remember, stick to the script. He nodded, picked up his cell phone, and dialed a number. I didn't want to tell Jim this, but it was the weak link in our plan. If they hadn't answered, we would have been left without luck. But I assumed that a call from Jim's phone would not go unanswered, and I was right. Jerry, said Jim, glad I caught you. Look, all these observations have finally come to fruition. You were right. Mandy really is having an affair. She left the office at noon, and I followed her to your house. Soon after, a man arrived and entered with her. They are there now. Even sitting across from Jim, I could hear Jerry's exclamation through the phone. I'm sure, Jerry, Jim confirmed. She greeted him at the door with a big hug and kiss. They are there now. If you hurry, you can catch them together. This time I clearly heard Jerry shout, "Bastard," and then hung up. I got up. I have to go, Jim. Once you make another call, please close the office when you leave. He stood up too, and I leaned across the coffee table to hug him. I hope this turns out to be right for you, I said. Remember, things will get better. Thank you for everything, Miss Sarah, he said, and surprised me by hugging me. Then I headed to my car. As I drove, I thought about Jim. I hope he enjoyed his cruise. This was something he had wanted to do for a long time, and it was hoped that the experience would not only create some distance between him and his marriage, but also provide him with some pleasant entertainment. At the same time, I knew that he had always planned this cruise with Peggy. Now he travels alone. I felt that he had difficult times ahead. My GPS worked well this time, so my trip took exactly as long as I planned. I parked the car in the driveway and confidently walked up to the front door, knocking sharply twice. She heard a commotion inside, and then the door swung open, revealing an attractive woman in her late 40s clutching her robe to herself. Her hair was disheveled and her makeup was smudged. I expected this. What's going on, Jerry? Is everything okay? Then she stopped, realizing that her visitor was not who she expected. Who are you? What do you need? Good afternoon, Mrs. Davenport. My name is Sarah Cannon, I answered calmly. Can I come in? One of the pleasant advantages of old age is the opportunity to do things that young people cannot afford. Peggy Davenport hesitated, but opened the door wider and stepped back. I quickly walked into her living room. We can talk here, I said. Confused, she sat down opposite me and pulled her robe tighter around her. Do I know you? She asked in confusion. No, Mrs. Davenport, but I know you, and you don't have to worry about Jerry Hamilton. I doubt your lover will return here today. She gasped, but tried to leave. I don't know what you're talking about, she said sharply. I think you'd better leave. I smiled weakly. Oh, I'll go, Mrs. Davenport, but first I have something for you. I handed her a stack of papers. What is this? She asked, looking at the papers with a blank look. Then, some words apparently caught her attention because she began to look at the top sheet more closely. This is a divorce petition. That's right, Mrs. Davenport. Jim Davenport filed for divorce. I am his lawyer, and you are now officially notified. This is absurd, she said sharply. He has no reason to want a divorce. Apparently, you didn't look at the entire stack of papers I gave you, I said calmly. She began to impatiently flip through the pages of the petition when she suddenly realized that the last few sheets contained images rather than text. Then she gasped again when she saw the photos Marcy took of Jerry and her in flagrante delicto. As she looked at them, her hands trembled, and she threw the entire stack onto the table as if it were a poisonous snake. "Where's Jim?" she asked sharply. "I have to talk to him. It's all a mistake. I have to explain to him what happened." "I'm afraid that's impossible," I said calmly. "Jim went on a month-long cruise today, and he doesn't want to see or talk to you about it. From now on, any information you want to convey to him, you must convey through me. You will find my phone number at the end of the petition." "It's not fair," she said sharply. "I have the right to talk to my own husband. He must listen to me. I am afraid that when you and Jerry Hamilton conspired to betray him so contemptuously, you forfeited any such right. You no longer have or deserve his attention or affection." I saw her thoughts racing in different directions, and she suddenly came back to something I said earlier. "Wait a minute, where's Jerry? Why won't he come? What did you do with him?" "You don't need to rely on Mr. Hamilton for help," I said. "He has his own problems. He is now being notified of a similar petition for divorce from Mrs. Hamilton as we speak." She just looked at me with her mouth open. "My business is almost finished, Mrs. Davenport, but before I go, I have a little advice for you. I know how much you strive for a luxurious lifestyle, but I'm afraid you will have to learn to live in reduced conditions. The financial settlement your husband is offering is fair, but it won't leave you rich. You should consult your own attorney, but I strongly recommend accepting Jim's offer. The petition I have presented to you is based on irreconcilable differences. If you choose to play games, we can easily change the basis to adultery, in which case the photographs you saw and the recording of your conversation with Mr. Hamilton will become part of the public record. I don't think you want this, Mrs. Davenport." She was about to say something when the phone started ringing. She turned to answer, but apparently changed her mind. Turning to me, she asked, "Are you sure this is your daughter calling to demand an explanation? Jim has already told her about this whole nasty business." She gasped again and then fell onto the couch, tears streaming from her eyes. I got up. "That concludes my business with you today, Mrs. Davenport. I'll go out by myself." I walked to the door and grabbed the handle, then turned towards her. "One more thing, Mrs. Davenport. I would take care of your robe and sofa. The evidence of your infidelity leaves stains today." She jumped up and turned around to see wet stains on the couch cushion. I heard her howl as I walked out the door and wondered if she was crying because of the stain on the couch or because of her reputation. When I returned to the office, Marcy was waiting. I recounted my visit to Mrs. Davenport, and I'm ashamed to admit that we both took an unhealthy amount of pleasure from her confusion. Then I demanded that Marcy tell her half of the story. She was happy to do it. I got to Davenport's house right after Mandy. She let me in, and I found a seat in the dining room. We had to wait for a while, but then we heard Jerry's car drive up and stop abruptly. She giggled. He ran to the front door and was so upset that he couldn't get the key in the lock. When he finally opened the door, Mandy was standing there, waiting. Jerry's face turned bright red and then suddenly turned pale when he saw Mandy's father sitting there. Her father stood up and gave the man a reprimand that would have made my old sergeant proud. "You should have seen it, Miss Sarah." Mandy went to stand next to her father and then turned to Jerry. "You think you're so smart, having an affair with Peggy Davenport, she told him. But you don't know everything. You think you got your job and title because you're such a hotshot. Well, you're wrong. The reason you were hired is because my father owns the company. He got you a job after our marriage, and now that we are getting divorced, he will arrange for your dismissal. Then Mandy gave me a sign, and I walked into the living room. Jerry was stunned. He had never seen me before and did not know who I was or why I was here. So I just walked up to him and handed him the envelope with his copy of the divorce petition. When he tore open the envelope, the first thing he saw were the photographs I had taken of him and Mrs. Davenport. When he saw Miss Sarah, his shoulders sank like a flat tire, and he just turned and walked out of the house. Marcy smiled again. It was perfect, Miss Sarah. He was a defeated man. Then her smile disappeared. But after he left, Mrs. Hamilton began to cry bitterly, and her father simply hugged her. They were both very upset, so I quietly left and returned here. She looked at me thoughtfully. I think it's a lot like war, Miss Sarah. Regardless of whether you win or lose, both sides suffer losses. After all the excitement of the two confrontations, the conclusion of the case was a bit of an anticlimax. The surprise of being caught cheating, coupled with the shock of losing his job and marriage, knocked the wind out of Jerry Hamilton. He did not contest the divorce or the proposed financial settlement. The division of Jerry and Mandy's property required putting their home on the market, but in a bad economy they received little more than what was left on the mortgage. Peggy ended up in an apartment, but at least without debt and with a job. Jerry was out of luck. Losing his job in the midst of an economic downturn was a bigger blow than losing his marriage. After unsuccessfully searching for work locally, he finally left Atlanta to seek work elsewhere. Mandy hasn't heard from him since then. For some reason, Peggy Davenport lost all interest in Jerry after learning that he had lost his job. Instead, she contacted me repeatedly, trying to arrange a meeting with Jim to reconcile. But he categorically refused to have any contact with her, and in the end she had to accept the inevitable. We have left the grounds for divorce as incompatible differences. There were some negotiations about dividing the property, but Jim ultimately offered her a house in lieu of alimony and other concessions. He told me he didn't mind giving the house away because he could never imagine himself living there again. Peggy had hoped that the equity in the house would provide the foundation to support her lifestyle, but she was disappointed to learn that its value was significantly lower than she expected. After the sale, she moved to Birmingham to live with her sister. There was one final ironic development in this case. The winter was mild, and we had a beautiful spring in Atlanta. Usually, early spring means a long, hot summer, but this time the mild temperatures lasted until May. The weather was so nice that Marcy and I decided to picnic at Piedmont Park again. We had just begun to lay out the food on our blanket when a man approached us. At first, I didn't recognize him because he had long hair and a well-groomed beard, but something in his eyes gave him away. I got up and went to hug him. "Jim," I exclaimed, "how wonderful to see you." "Hello, Miss Sarah. Hi, Marcy," he said almost shyly. "It's been a long time." "It's been a long time," I agreed. "Almost 8 months. How are you?" "Much better," he said. "I had some difficulties when my divorce became final, but a lot of good things happened, and it really helped." He pointed, and a pretty blonde sitting on a blanket under the trees waved back. "I see," I said with a small smile. "I've been wanting to come and see you and Marcy," he continued. "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did last year." He smiled. "The story of your meeting with Peggy made me feel much better." I didn't say anything. Even now, I wasn't sure if I had done the right thing by confronting her like that. But it was clear that Jim had no doubts, and perhaps that was important. "There is something else I wanted to tell you, Miss Sarah," he continued. "I recently received news from my old company. It appears that the reason they fired some of us was to make the company more attractive to a corporate buyer. Well, it worked. A large multinational corporation just made an offer to buy." I looked at him, puzzled. "That's very interesting, Jim, but how does it affect you?" He smiled. When they fired me, they let me keep my stock options. They had no value at the time because they were below market, so Peggy didn't want them in the divorce settlement. But after the offer to purchase, based on today's share price, they are worth almost $1 million. Congratulations, Jim, I exclaimed. What wonderful news. I am so happy for you. Thank you, Miss Sarah. As he began to return to his lunch companion, he turned for a moment. I hope Peggy hears the news, he said with a satisfied smile. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.